The heel of her shoe echoed like a warning. Papers rustled. Whispers. A sudden hand on my chest. "Just close your eyes, Mom," she said sweetly. Then the sharp tug on my oxygen line. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But I heard everything. Click. Beep. Silence. My daughter-in-law stood at the monitor, smirking. My daughter laughed. What kind of bedtime stories end like this? Who watches their own child steal their life and their breath with a smile? They thought I wouldn't wake up, but someone else was watching. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment saying AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. They thought I wouldn't hear them. They thought the machines had drowned me out, that the whir of the ventilator and the steady blip of the monitor meant I was already half gone. But I heard every word. Lying in that ICU bed, my body frail, my voice locked behind tubes and tape, I listened as my daughter Vanessa stood at the foot of the bed and whispered the words that still sting in my ears. "It's better this way." She didn't cry. Her tone wasn't even sad. It was cold, calculated like this was just another item to cross off a list. I felt her presence before I saw her. The familiar scent of her perfume reached me first, something floral and expensive that once reminded me of spring, not anymore. She leaned closer, thinking I was unconscious, and then she said it soft and slow, like she was comforting herself more than anyone else. "We took it all. The money's gone. You won't remember this. But I did. I do. Every breath, every movement of her mouth, every sickening ounce of ease in her voice as she confessed. My chest rose and fell with shallow effort, but my mind was razor sharp. I saw her lips form the words. I felt her hand on the oxygen line, not pulling, not yet but resting there, a silent threat disguised as tenderness. Behind her stood Marcy, my daughter-in-law, younger, quieter. She didn't speak either, but her smirk told me everything. It wasn't grief I saw in her, it was relief, the kind of peace people feel when they finally rid themselves of something inconvenient, and in that moment, I realized what I had become to them. A burden, a waiting game, a dying mother with just enough left to steal. They thought they'd won, that I wouldn't wake up, that my silence was permanent. But I had known for months something was off. Quiet changes in bank balances, unexpected documents sent for me to sign. The way Marcy kept offering to handle my prescriptions, so I planned. I called Joan. Joan Harlow was my friend for over 40 years. She had seen me through my husband's death, the bankruptcy that nearly stole our home, and the hard winters when I worked double shifts just to keep Vanessa in ballet lessons. She was the one I trusted, and a year ago, over tea and cinnamon rolls, I told her my fears, that my own family might be circling, that if I ever couldn't speak for myself, I needed someone who could. We set up everything: security protocols, an alert system, a financial tripwire that would notify the bank and law enforcement if anyone touched that account without my consent, and most importantly, a clause in my trust if any fraudulent activity occurred, the entire estate would freeze, and my medical decisions would transfer to my son, Andrew. Andrew, my quiet one, my only son. We hadn't spoken much in the past year, not since a family argument that left him estranged from Vanessa, but he had always promised me one thing: if anything happens to you, Mom, I'll be the one standing with answers, not excuses. I remembered that, and I held on to it like a lifeline. Vanessa and Marcy were still in the room when it happened. A faint chime echoed from the monitor behind me, barely audible, but I knew that sound. Joan had told me exactly what it would mean. The alert had been triggered. 3 hours after the money disappeared, the system called out. Not loud, not flashy, just enough. I couldn't turn my head. I couldn't lift my hands. But inside, I smiled. They didn't see it coming. Then the door flew open hard, purposeful. I felt the wind from the hallway rush in, and I knew. I knew who it was before I saw his face. Andrew. He stepped inside like a storm that had finally found its purpose. Behind him came 2 uniformed officers and a plain-clothed man who immediately flashed a badge. Vanessa turned. Her face paled. Marcy froze in place. The man with the badge spoke calmly. No drama, no yelling. Vanessa Whitmore? Marcy Doyle? I'm with the Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with you, both regarding unauthorized transfers exceeding federal thresholds. For a second, no one moved. Then everything changed. Marcy's face cracked first. Vanessa's voice rose, trembling with denial. Andrew didn't say a word. He walked straight to my bedside and took my hand. And for the first time in hours, my heart monitor jumped. Because I wasn't alone anymore. Andrew didn't flinch. His hand held mine gently, like he used to when he was a boy, when I'd come home late from a second shift and he'd sit beside me on the couch, saying nothing but offering everything. He squeezed my fingers, not hard, just enough to remind me I was still here. Still me. The plainclothes officer, Detective Rowan, stepped forward, his voice steady as stone. Miss Whitmore, he said, looking at Vanessa. You're being investigated under suspicion of financial fraud, attempted identity theft, and potential endangerment of a vulnerable adult. You have the right to remain silent. Vanessa cut him off. This is a misunderstanding, she snapped. Her voice was sharper now, full of panic, trying to wear the mask of authority. I'm her daughter. I have power of attorney. We were simply— You don't, Andrew interrupted. You lost that authority when you forged her signature, when you tried to take everything. The weight of his words dropped like lead. Marcy backed away from the bed slowly, her face flushed, her mouth working but no words coming. She looked like she was about to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The officers moved forward, calm, controlled, hands at their belts but not yet reaching. Rowan held out a folder. We have documents signed at Charleston Federal Savings, he said. Surveillance footage, timestamps, and a full financial trail of the transfer, $2.2 million, split into 4 accounts in an attempt to avoid reporting thresholds. Marcy's knees buckled slightly. She caught herself on the foot of the bed. I didn't know, she whispered. It wasn't my idea. It was hers. Vanessa spun to her. Excuse me? You said it was safe, Marcy hissed. You said the documents were already approved. Detective Rowan stepped between them. That's enough, he said. We're taking statements separately. You'll both be transported to the precinct. For a moment, no one moved. And then, like the final scene in a play, the cuffs came out. Quick metal clicks, sharp and clean. Vanessa looked stunned, her mouth open, not speaking. Her eyes locked on mine and I stared back. I saw no remorse, only rage. They had planned to erase me. Quietly, completely. But they forgot something crucial. I had prepared. Joan arrived seconds later. She walked in holding a thick folder, her hair pulled back, her eyes focused. She didn't glance at Vanessa or Marcy. She didn't need to. She walked straight to Detective Rowan and handed him the file. All the documentation is here, she said. The trust agreement, digital logs, email chains, even notarized statements. Everything we discussed. Rowan opened it, nodded, then looked at me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, quieter now. This folder, it's airtight. We're moving forward tonight. Joan came to my side and reached for my hand. She didn't speak. She just squeezed gently, her eyes glinting with both sorrow and strength. We had spent a year putting that file together just in case. And now, just in case, had arrived. Andrew stood near the window, jaw tight, the lines around his mouth deeper than I remembered. He wasn't the boy who used to bring me dandelions in the spring. He was a man now, made hard by the distance this family had forced between us. I told you, he said, looking down at Vanessa. I told you if you did anything to her, I'd be there with answers. Vanessa didn't speak. The officers began escorting her and Marcy from the room. As they reached the hallway, Marcy glanced back at me just once. Her expression was different from Vanessa's, not angry, not bitter, just empty. I don't know if she was hoping I'd say something. Maybe to forgive her, maybe to beg her to stop. I didn't. The silence between us was already filled with too much. When they were gone, the room felt larger, less crowded, but not lighter. Not yet. Joan stepped away to speak with Rowan in private, and Andrew sat in the chair beside me. He didn't say anything for a long while. He just sat there, fingers interlaced, breathing in sync with the soft beeps of the monitor beside me. The truth was, I hadn't heard his voice in almost a year, not since our last family gathering turned into an argument, the kind with old wounds and sharp tongues. Vanessa had mocked him for calling me overly cautious. Marcy had scoffed when he questioned her eagerness to help manage my accounts. He had left early, quietly, not saying goodbye. But now here he was. Steady, present. He reached into a folder he'd brought and laid down a series of documents on the rolling tray beside me. "They're pressing charges tonight," he said. "Fraud, attempted medical interference, identity theft, and the trust is holding." He looked at me, and for a moment, something soft broke through his expression. "You're protected, Mom." I blinked. Once. That was all I could give him, but he knew what it meant. "You did good," he said. The nurse returned Cecilia Vaughn. She was younger than most, eyes like someone who had seen more than her years should have allowed. She checked my vitals, adjusted my line. Then she looked down at me. "I saw what happened," she said softly. "I didn't know what to do at first, but I told them. I hope that was right." My fingers barely moved, but she caught it. She smiled a quiet one and nodded before slipping out of the room. When the door closed, I turned my gaze to the ceiling. The light above hummed, steady, the way it always had. But inside me, something shifted. They thought I would die quietly. They thought I wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight. But I heard everything, and now they would hear me. The morning after the arrests, the hospital was quieter than usual, but not in the peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, when everyone is still trying to make sense of what just blew through. Nurses no longer made idle chatter near my door. Doctors paused in the hallway but didn't enter unless absolutely necessary. They had seen what happened, and now they didn't know how to look at me. I didn't need their pity. I didn't need their discomfort either. What I needed was already in motion. Joan came in just before sunrise, holding a cup of coffee and a new folder. She always brought paper, always brought answers. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot as if measuring what came next. "They've frozen all 4 accounts," she said. The system triggered an automatic fraud alert when the transfer hit a flagged routing number. They were sloppy, split the money into shell accounts that hadn't been used in months. She turned to me, her expression firm. "Andrew's already filed to invoke his full medical authority as your secondary proxy. The trust clause held up, Clara. Everything we planned is working." My eyes met hers, and I blinked. One blink. The only way I could thank her. She walked over and placed the folder on the tray beside my bed. "In here," she said, tapping it, "is everything you asked me to prepare. All the updates to the trust, the new emergency plan, and a backup key to the safe deposit box. You're safe, Clara. Really safe." And for the first time in days, I felt it. Not just physical safety, but something deeper. The kind that tells you your life, your name, your dignity have not been stolen. Andrew arrived shortly after. His hair was still damp from a quick shower. His shirt wrinkled from sleeping in a chair all night. He carried 2 cell phones and a laptop. "They want a statement," he said, not wasting time. "News outlets are already circling. The arrest made local headlines. Someone from the hospital must have leaked it." He opened the laptop and pulled up a paused video. A security still from the bank. Vanessa and Marcy seated at the desk, pens in hand, laughing. No pressure, no hesitation, just greed. Then the video began to play. The motion was slow, deliberate. Vanessa smiling as she signed. Marcy glancing away. The timestamp visible. The bank's logo in the corner. Everything matched the transaction logs. The screen froze on my name, forged at the bottom of the form. Joan had told me once, back when we first set up the trust, "If they ever come for you, make sure the paper trail speaks louder than they can." And now it did. Andrew turned the screen toward me. "Detective Rowan wants to use this in a press conference," he said. "He asked if we have your permission. I told him it's your story, your call." I blinked once. No more hiding. Not for me, not for them. Later that afternoon, the press set up outside the hospital. 2 camera crews, a radio reporter, a few curious onlookers. It wasn't chaos. It was something quieter, serious. Detective Rowan stood behind a small podium, flanked by uniformed officers. He didn't give names. He didn't need to. The footage did it for him. When the video played Vanessa's smile, Marcy's easy nod, the forged signature, the crowd didn't react with outrage. Just silence. That terrible, knowing kind of silence that says, "We've seen this before. Just not like this." Joan watched the live stream on her tablet across from my bed. "They always underestimated you," she said quietly. "Thought they were clever. Thought you were too old, too kind, too trusting." She glanced at me. They forgot who taught them how to survive. That night, the hospital administrator stopped by. He wore a polite mask, professional concern, corporate caution. "We're reviewing internal procedures," he said. "Abigail's statement has been corroborated. If you need anything legal, medical, otherwise our office is fully committed." I said nothing. He left quickly. Later, Cecilia came in. Not to check vitals, just to see me. She brought a small bouquet wildflowers, a little wilted around the edges. No card. She sat at the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I transferred to another ward," she said. "Too many questions here, but I wanted to tell you. What you did, it reminded me that silence isn't always safe, that sometimes speaking up is the only way forward." I reached for her hand, just barely, but she saw it. She smiled and nodded once, then left. After she was gone, I lay there listening to the low hum of the machines, the oxygen, the monitor, the hidden rhythm of my own body still fighting. They tried to erase me. They really thought I wouldn't remember, wouldn't respond. But I remembered everything. The baby I held when Vanessa was born, the scraped knees I bandaged, the nights I worked double shifts to pay her tuition, the court hearings I attended when her first marriage fell apart, the food I cooked when she moved back in, the bills I covered when she called it temporary. They didn't just take money. They tried to take me. But I had planned for that too. And now, everything they tried to bury was rising into the light. 3 days passed. That's all it took. 3 days for their names to go from whispered rumors in Charleston to bold headlines stretching across the bottom of every screen in the country. The first article had been local. A quiet headline. Elderly woman's estate protected after alleged family fraud. But then the video footage leaked. Then came the audio. I don't know who released it. Maybe it was a nurse. Maybe someone in law enforcement thought the public deserved the full truth. All I know is that within hours, the entire country had heard my daughter's voice whisper, "She won't even feel it. Let's just say goodbye and be done with it." The internet doesn't forget. And neither did I. By the 4th day, Vanessa and Marcy had both lost their jobs. Marcy's hospital board seat was revoked. Vanessa's firm released a single-line press release that read, "We hold all employees to the highest standards of ethical conduct." There were no apologies. No press conferences, only silence from their end. But it didn't matter, because the world was already filling in the blanks. People began sending letters to the hospital, cards, flowers, notes from strangers, women who'd survived similar betrayals, men who'd lost their mothers without ever making amends, caregivers who feared the same thing happening on their watch. Some just wrote to say, "I believe you." I never asked for any of it, but I read every word. One woman wrote from Ohio. Her name was Margaret. She said her daughter took her car, emptied her account, and left her alone in a nursing home without telling anyone. Margaret had no legal recourse, no proof. "But now," she wrote, "when I tell my story, people won't roll their eyes. They'll say, like the Whitmore case, and that will be enough." Andrew printed every letter and read them aloud at my bedside. Some made him pause. Others made him grip my hand a little tighter. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said one night. "It never was, really." And he was right. At the courthouse, the charges stacked quickly. Detective Rowan worked fast. The financial records from the shell accounts came in transfers to a Cayman account under a dummy corporation tied to Vanessa. The forgery wasn't even subtle. A handwriting expert confirmed it within hours. Marcy took a deal. Of course she did. Pleaded guilty to assisting in the fraud, in exchange for leniency and a promise to testify against Vanessa. Her voice shook during the hearing. She never looked in my direction. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't deserve it. Vanessa refused any deal. She wanted to fight. She thought she could out-talk the evidence, outmaneuver the paper trail. But this wasn't a family argument anymore. It was federal. And the government doesn't flinch. Joan kept everything organized. She called me daily, updated the folder, tracked every subpoena. She spoke with confidence, and the kind of clarity only older women have, the kind that comes after a lifetime of being underestimated. One morning, Andrew brought me a small envelope. "She left this at your house," he said. Slipped it through the mail slot. No return address. I turned it over. I knew the handwriting. Vanessa's. He didn't open it. He didn't even ask if I wanted to. I didn't. I placed it in the same folder Joan had built, the one labeled Trust Documents and Final Directives. I didn't need to read her justifications, her anger, her rewritten version of what she'd done. I already knew who she was. The real moment came a week later, not in a courtroom, not in a press release. It came when Vanessa walked into my hospital room. She had asked Andrew to let her see me. One time. Just once. He hadn't agreed. He'd asked me. I didn't answer right away. But that morning, I woke up and said, "Let her." I don't know what I expected. Maybe a breakdown, maybe defiance. But when the door opened and she walked in, I saw neither. She looked hollow, not broken, not humbled, just empty. Her hair was tied back in a knot that wasn't quite neat. Her clothes looked expensive but wrinkled. Her face carried the kind of exhaustion money can't hide. She didn't sit down. "I don't know what to say," she began. I didn't move. I didn't mean for it to go this far. My breath came slow through the mask. I watched her. I just thought I deserved something. After everything, that word echoed in my ears. Deserved. As if love had been a transaction. As if years of sacrifice came with a bill she never intended to pay. She took a breath. Her hands twisted the strap of her purse. I know I messed up. I blinked slowly. Not a response. Just acknowledgement. She stepped closer, then stopped herself. "You always loved Andrew more," she said, as if she believed it. And for the first time in days, I found my voice not with sound, but with presence. I lifted my hand, just barely, and pointed at the door. She stared. "This isn't fair," she whispered, and I blinked again, slowly, once. It was the last thing I gave her. She turned and walked out. Andrew came in minutes later. He didn't ask what she said. He didn't need to. He picked up the folder on the tray, added one more document to it, a notarized statement signed by me, declaring that Vanessa Whitmore was permanently removed from all medical, legal, and estate-related decision-making. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. For myself, for the peace I had earned, for the name I had reclaimed. It was strange, the way the world moved on. A week after Vanessa's visit, the media frenzy began to quiet. There were new headlines, political drama, celebrity scandals, a hurricane in Florida. The news cycle shifted, as it always does. And just like that, the cameras left the hospital entrance, the reporters stopped calling, and my name slowly drifted from trending lists to archived stories. But what they didn't see was that the real story had just begun. The silence that followed was not peace. Not yet. It was the absence of noise, and in that quiet, I could finally hear myself again. Not the voice of fear or grief or outrage, but the steady hum of my own mind, asking, "Now what?" Andrew came by every morning. He no longer wore the same rumpled clothes. He slept now, ate better. I think watching it all unravel had freed something in him too, something he'd carried for years. Guilt, maybe, or the quiet weight of always being the one who stepped back. He didn't do that anymore. One morning, he brought a form in a manila envelope and placed it in my lap. I was stronger now, sitting up most days, eating real meals, breathing without the oxygen mask. "They want you to speak," he said. "The foundation, women's centers, a few universities even." He paused, then added, "You don't have to. I told them I'd ask, but not pressure." I looked at the form. The heading read, "Keynote Speaker Application. National Summit on Elder Advocacy and Estate Rights. I hadn't been a keynote speaker since my daughter's third-grade science fair, but something inside me stirred not pride, not revenge, something simpler, a desire to turn the wreckage into something someone else could walk across. That afternoon I said yes. And just like that, the story that began in silence began to speak again, this time through me. 2 weeks later, I was discharged from the hospital. Joan picked me up herself in her old car, the same one she'd driven since her husband passed. It still smelled like cinnamon gum and old perfume. She didn't speak at first, just helped me in, adjusted the seatbelt, and started the engine. We didn't go home. Instead, we drove to a building near the edge of Charleston, a modest blue and white center with peeling paint and a faded sign that read, Low Country Women's Resource Alliance. I had donated here for years. Quietly, monthly checks, a few warm blankets in the winter. Nothing public, nothing dramatic. But this time, it was different. Inside, we met with the director, a woman in her 50s, named Carla. Strong hands, eyes like stone. She didn't mention the case. She didn't ask about Vanessa or Marcy. She simply offered me tea, then waited for me to speak. I handed her the folder. Inside were documents transferring the remaining funds of my trust into a new foundation, the Clara Whitmore Fund for Dignity in Aging. It would provide legal aid, emergency housing, and estate planning support for women over 60 who had been financially exploited, abandoned, or erased by their own families. It included my home, the vacation cabin no one in my family knew I still owned, and what was left of the $2.2 million they tried to steal. Carla opened the folder slowly. She didn't smile, didn't gasp. She just reached across the table and pressed her hand over mine. I know exactly who this is for, she said. So did I. That afternoon, we sat in the garden behind the center, Joan, Carla, and me. The sun filtered through rosemary bushes and a crooked oak tree that bent toward the west, like it was listening for something. Andrew arrived with June, his daughter. 6 years old, missing a front tooth, her braid lopsided, her sneakers scuffed. She ran to me and handed me a drawing, a house, a tree, a swing, and a woman with silver hair smiling from the porch. It's you, she said proudly. I looked at Andrew. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. They hadn't hidden the story from her. They just told it in pieces she could carry. June sat beside me on the bench, swinging her legs. Are you famous now? She asked. No, I said, just louder. She nodded like that. Made perfect sense. That night, back at Joan's house where I stayed during recovery, I sat at her kitchen table and opened a fresh notebook, not to write a statement, not to prepare for a speech, just to remember. I wrote down every moment I had felt erased, every time I had doubted myself, every breath I held when someone I loved made me feel like too much or not enough. I wrote Vanessa's name, then crossed it out. I wasn't writing about her anymore. I was writing about me, about how easy it is to disappear when you've spent your whole life holding everyone else up, about how dangerous silence becomes when you confuse it with love, about the day I stopped waiting for an apology to free me. I didn't write for vengeance. I wrote to return home to myself. And when I closed the notebook, I realized I wasn't finished. Not with the words, not with the work, not with the life I had left. The first speaking engagement was small, just a folding room at the Charleston Community Hall with bad lighting and a faint smell of old coffee. No camera crews, no velvet chairs. Just 23 women, most of them over 60, sitting on metal chairs with manila folders clutched tightly in their laps. They weren't here for inspiration. They were here for answers. Carla introduced me with just one line, "You know who she is." And then she stepped aside. I stood behind the lectern, fingers grazing the edge. I didn't have notes. I didn't have a speech. I had truth. I'm not here to teach you how to be angry, I said. You already know how. I'm here to tell you that your anger is not a burden, it's a signal. And you are not wrong for feeling it. Some women blinked slowly. Others stared at the floor. I let people sign my name when I should have said no, I continued. I let people call me bitter when I was really just tired. I let them silence me because I didn't want to start a fight. But they started it anyway. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I'm here today because someone put their hand on my oxygen line and thought that was the end of my story. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. A few women nodded. One dabbed at her eyes with the edge of a tissue. And you're not here because you're weak. You're here because something in you refused to stay quiet. You still want to live. That matters. And the room didn't erupt in applause. That wasn't the point. What I saw instead were backs straightening, shoulders settling, eyes lifting, something loosening in the air, like a room full of women finally allowed to exhale. Afterward, a woman named Lorraine came up to me. She wore a patchwork shawl and carried a handbag with fraying seams. I moved out of my son's house last week, she said. He told his wife to stop cooking dinner for me, said I should be grateful they let me stay at all. I wasn't on the mailbox. I wasn't on the lease. I was just extra. She took a breath. But then I saw your story. I walked into Carla's office and asked for help, and she handed me a key, a real one, to a door that was mine. She didn't cry when she told me. Neither did I. We just stood there. Two women who had once been made to feel like ghosts, now looking each other in the eye like equals. The foundation grew faster than any of us expected. Joan handled the paperwork. Carla led the daily operations. Andrew helped build a website with resources, intake forms, and stories from women around the country who wanted to contribute not just money, but time, guidance, language. Within 2 months, the fund had helped 37 women secure emergency housing, 12 file legal complaints against abusive relatives, and 5 pursue criminal cases. But the real impact wasn't in the numbers. It was in the shift. At the grocery store, women who used to avoid eye contact now smiled softly at me. Some nodded with quiet recognition. Some just placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "Thank you." They didn't need to say for what. We both knew. I had become something I never asked to be a signal. A living reminder that survival wasn't a private act. It could ripple. It could echo. It could rebuild the world around you if you let it. Abigail came to visit one Saturday morning. She transferred to another hospital wing, but she never stopped checking in. She brought muffins and news and a few timid questions about estate law. Her mother had recently been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's. The family was already circling. Brothers, cousins, helpers, who suddenly wanted to manage things. "I don't want it to happen to her," Abigail said quietly. "I don't want to wait until it's too late to draw the line." Ed. We spent 2 hours filling out forms, explaining guardianship, reviewing power of attorney clauses. Abigail cried once, just once, when she said, "I thought being the good daughter meant saying yes, but now I think it means saying enough." I told her that's how I started too. Not with anger, with enough. Later that week, the mail brought a letter from a community center in another state. They had read about the fund in a nonprofit newsletter. They wanted permission to replicate the model. "We don't need your money," the director wrote. "We need your blueprint." I sent them everything. Policies, outreach plans, budget samples, intake forms. I even offered to Zoom into their first board meeting. They called their version the dignity table. I liked that. There is something sacred about the act of naming your resistance, of saying, "Here, sit, you still belong." The town didn't change overnight. The streets still flooded when it rained. The mail still came late. The neighbor's dog still barked through the fence every morning. But something else had shifted, a hum under the surface. A quiet kind of pride, not the flashy kind, but the kind that lives in community potlucks and shared glances and second chances. I wasn't famous. I didn't want to be. But I was seen. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The frost came early that winter, settling on the porch railings like lace stitched by the night. The mornings in Charleston had turned sharp, brisk enough that I could see my breath when I opened the window, a crack to feel the air. The sky was that particular kind of pale gray that made everything look older. Even the house felt quieter. I had been out of the hospital for over a month by then, and life had taken on a rhythm again. Not the same one I'd lived before. This one was slower, more deliberate. Less about filling time and more about letting it pass without needing to explain it. I spent most mornings in the kitchen, where the sunlight slanted in through the old lace curtains. I'd sit with a cup of tea, and listened to the wood creak beneath the chair legs, the way it had since my husband and I bought this house more than 30 years ago. It creaked differently now. Like it, too, was adjusting to the weight that had shifted. Every Sunday, Andrew came over with June. She'd barge through the front door like she owned the place, carrying a new drawing or some lopsided craft made of pipe cleaners and glitter. Her voice filled the rooms like spring. "This one's for you, Grandma," she'd say, her missing front tooth making the sound whistle just a little. She never asked about Vanessa. Children have a sense for tension, for what not to name. Instead, she asked if we could bake cookies, or if the stars could follow people around when they walked, or whether butterflies had best friends. Important questions. Joan visited often, too. She'd bring a pie or a batch of scones, talk about the foundation, and every now and then, she'd mention someone who'd reached out, a woman in her 60s, who had just filed her first restraining order, a widow who'd found her voice again in court, a daughter who had chosen to protect her mother instead of dismiss her. Joan kept the updates simple. She knew I didn't need fanfare. I just needed to know the work we started was still alive. And then there was the letter. It had been sitting in the drawer next to my bed for nearly 4 weeks. A cream-colored envelope, thick, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Vanessa had slipped it through Andrew's mail slot. She hadn't asked to come in. She hadn't tried to call since that last, brief hospital visit. But she had sent that letter, and I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not because I feared what it might say. No. I could imagine the contents, well enough justifications, subtle blame, maybe even a watered-down apology that never once used the words, "I'm sorry." Maybe she'd spin it into something she thought I'd accept. Maybe she'd call it desperation, misunderstanding, love. But it didn't matter. Because that letter was no longer about her. It was about me. Every day I opened that drawer, looked at the envelope, then closed it again. At first I told myself I'd read it when I was ready. Then I told myself I was making a point, asserting my boundaries. But the truth was simpler and harder. I didn't need to read it. Because healing, I'd learned, isn't always about resolution. Sometimes it's about choosing not to reopen what you've already survived. Still, one night, I pulled it out and held it in my hands. The paper was smooth, weighty. Vanessa had always cared about presentation. She would have chosen the best stationery. She would have sat at her kitchen table with a pen that matched the ink perfectly. She probably practiced a few lines first, scratched out a few versions. And yet, she still never once called me Mom in that hospital room. She never looked me in the eyes and said anything real. I turned the envelope over, pressed a thumb against the seal, and then stopped. I didn't need to prove anything to myself. I set it back in the drawer. That night, I slept soundly. A few days later, a familiar voice came through the receiver of my landline. "Clara," he said. "It's Reverend Cole." The last time I'd heard from him was the day of my husband's funeral. He had stood beside me in the small chapel, hands clasped, his voice low and unhurried, offering no cliches, no verses meant to numb. Just presence, that was his gift. Silence that understood. "I saw your name in the paper again," he said now. And I thought, that woman's not finished yet, or now. He asked if he could stop by. He arrived the next morning wearing the same brown coat I remembered, though it hung a little looser now. His hair had gone completely silver, but his eyes were still clear. He brought banana bread, wrapped in a paper towel, and a folded-up newspaper with crossword puzzles circled in pen. We sat on the porch with our coats pulled tight, knees wrapped in blankets, the wind biting but not unbearable. He didn't ask about Vanessa. Instead, after a long silence, he said, "Do you feel peace?" I took a moment to answer. "I feel clear," I said. "I don't know if that's peace, but it's something." He nodded, like he understood. "She wrote to me," he said. I turned slightly. "Vanessa." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another envelope, thinner than the one in my drawer. "She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just asked to be heard." I didn't touch it. "She asked me to pray for her," he added. "Not to change her situation, just for something inside her to soften." I said nothing. After a while, he stood to leave. He placed the envelope on the railing beside the rocking chair. "You don't owe her reconciliation," he said. "But sometimes, peace grows from understanding why someone broke in the first place." He rested his hand on my shoulder before walking down the steps. When he left, I didn't pick up the letter. I didn't open it. I just watched the frost begin to bloom again across the edge of the railing. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote something on the back of an old envelope. Not a letter, not a declaration, just one sentence. I released the need to know why she did it. I folded it in half, placed it in the same drawer as the letter and closed it. Not locked, just closed. Because sometimes, the greatest act of healing is deciding which pain no longer belongs to you. I used to think change came in shouts, that the world only moved when you pushed hard enough, yelled loud enough, fought visibly. But now, sitting in the back garden of the community center on a folding chair with a worn cushion, I understood something deeper, more lasting. Sometimes the loudest change comes in a whisper, a pause, a woman standing a little taller when she signs her name, a phone call that begins with, "I need help," and ends with, "Thank you for listening." End quote. The Clara Whitmore Foundation had grown into something I couldn't have imagined a year ago. What started as protection had become permission. Permission for women to step forward, to speak the truth, to reject the idea that being older meant being invisible. Carla kept the engine running. Joan kept the gears turning. I simply showed up when they asked. That afternoon, I was attending a small round-table discussion on elder autonomy. The room was full of women who looked like me, and women who looked like who I used to be. Some wore cardigans with tissues tucked in the sleeves. Others wore bold lipstick and gold hoop earrings. A few were in wheelchairs. One woman carried her documents in a reusable grocery bag with fading slogans on the side. They all had stories. Some told them. Some didn't need to. You could see the history in the way they crossed their arms, in the way they flinched when someone mentioned power of attorney, or housing, or sons. One woman, her name was Rosalind, stood up and said, "I spent 20 years in silence, thinking I was the one who ruined everything. Then I saw your face on the news, and for the first time I thought, maybe I'm not the crazy one." I didn't know what to say, so I stood and walked to her. We hugged, like survivors often do without ceremony, without apology. She smelled like lilac, soap, and old leather. After the event, I lingered in the garden behind the building. There was a bench nestled beneath a tree that had lost most of its leaves, but still clung stubbornly to the last few like it didn't want the season to end just yet. Andrew arrived just as the sun dipped lower. He didn't say much. He never did when words weren't needed. He handed me a thin stack of mail, some paperwork, and a drawing from June. This one was of me, standing next to what looked like a castle. She'd written, "Grandma's House of Safety," above it in bright blue crayon. I smiled, then flipped through the rest of the mail. There was a letter from a town I'd never heard of, Sandusky, Ohio. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but full of intent. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I was placed in a care facility by my children last year. They said it was temporary. It's been 15 months. No visits, no calls. But a nurse showed me your story, and I remembered who I used to be. So I'm leaving. I'm going to live in a senior co-op nearby. I have no furniture, no money. But I have my name again. That will have to be enough. Thank you for reminding me that I'm still mine." There was no signature, just a line that read, "Age 74, still standing." I folded the letter gently and slipped it into my coat pocket. Not to save, but to carry, because some words deserve to be close to your heart. Later that week, we hosted an open house at the center. It wasn't formal. No podiums, no speeches. Just warm cider, mismatched mugs, and a table full of cookies made by whoever had time. A woman named Dee brought her grandson. He was 13, lanky, awkward. She introduced him as my reason for not giving up. He helped set up chairs without being asked. A young woman named Mel arrived with a tray of cornbread and a hesitant smile. I remembered her from a previous event. She'd spoken about her mother, a woman who had died in obscurity, silenced by her own siblings, dismissed as dramatic. Mel had found the foundation by accident. Now, she was applying for a grant to start a podcast for women over 50 who wanted to tell their stories. "You made me believe there's still time," she said, "not just for justice, but for joy." I didn't have a reply. Just a hand on her shoulder. Firm, steady. That night, After the open house ended, I walked home alone. It was dark, but not frightening. The sidewalks were familiar. The leaves crunching beneath my shoes felt like a rhythm I could follow. I passed houses with dim porch lights, mailboxes leaning just slightly, wind chimes singing songs they didn't know they were writing. Charleston in winter had always had a sleepy charm, but now it felt alive. Not with noise, with presence. I reached my porch, unlocked the door, and stepped into the warmth. Inside, the heater hummed like a tired friend. The house smelled faintly of tea and wood polish. I set the letter from Ohio on the mantel, June's drawing next to it. Then I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. There were no sounds but my own breath. Even, steady. I pulled out the old folder Joan had given me, the one with the trust documents, the plans, the safeguards. I slipped one more thing inside, a handwritten note on blank paper that read, "This house, this name, this story, it's all mine now." I sealed it. Not with tape, just by folding the flap down. Because now I knew some things didn't need locks. They just needed to be held with care. The house was smaller than any place I'd ever lived in. 1 story, 2 bedrooms, an eat-in kitchen with checkered linoleum floors and cabinets that creaked when you opened them too fast. The walls were plain, off-white, slightly uneven, in places like the bones of an old body that had been asked to hold too much for too long. But it was mine. It sat on the quiet edge of Charleston, nestled between a grove of cedar trees and an old church with chipped bricks and a bell that only rang for weddings and funerals now. There was a porch just big enough for 2 rocking chairs and a small patch of yard where the grass came in patchy but stubborn. It wasn't grand, it wasn't new, but it was enough. Andrew helped me move in. He did most of the heavy lifting. His wife sent over blankets and a stack of clean towels. June came, too, dragging a box labeled "Important Things" in bright crayon letters. It was filled with her drawings and 2 ceramic coasters she'd made in art class. "This one's for your tea," she said proudly, handing me a lopsided piece painted blue and green. "And this one's for when I visit." Joan arrived later with her van and a fresh pie and stayed long enough to fuss about curtain rods and light bulbs. She insisted on helping me arrange my shelves, 3 of them, all told holding nothing more than a few cookbooks, a framed photo of my husband from our 35th anniversary, and a porcelain bird I'd kept since Vanessa was in kindergarten. We didn't talk about Vanessa. We didn't need to. The past was not banished from this new home, but it was not invited to take up space. The first night I spent in the house, I stood in the kitchen for a long time after everyone left. The silence was different than hospital silence or courtroom silence. It wasn't heavy or sterile. It had shape. It belonged to me. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window. Outside, the wind carried dry leaves across the driveway. The trees swayed like they were nodding to some rhythm only they could hear. I kept a small lamp on, the kind with a warm bulb that flickered now and then. It was enough light to remind me I wasn't lost. Enough darkness to let me rest. The heater kicked on, humming like an old friend, settling into a story we'd both heard before. When I climbed into bed, the sheets were cold but clean. The mattress didn't dip in the middle like the one in my old house. It held me like it believed I still had shape. I didn't dream. I didn't wake startled. I simply slept. And when morning came, I opened my eyes and thought, this is mine. All of it. Finally. In the weeks that followed, I found a rhythm. Every morning I brewed my tea, opened the window just enough to feel the air, and sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand, not to write anything profound, just to remind myself that my name still held meaning when written on paper. Clara Whitmore. Sometimes I wrote it on envelopes. Sometimes in the margins of the newspaper. Once on the back of a utility bill just because I could. The name was mine again. No one was forging it. No one was using it to move money or to sign hospital papers meant to silence me. I wrote it slowly, like a prayer, and let it sit there on the page without apology. The community found me, even though I never announced myself. Neighbors stopped by with extra baked goods, or cuttings from their gardens, or nothing at all, just curiosity. They knew who I was. Not from the news. From whispers. From the story that had taken on a life of its own. But they didn't ask for details. They didn't want drama. They wanted to know how I was growing tomatoes in a yard that barely got sun, or if I preferred sweet or dill pickles, or if I'd heard about the knitting club at the local rec center. They treated me like someone who still had something to offer. And maybe, finally, I believed them. One Friday, Joan brought over an old armchair she said had just enough life left to hold a woman with a spine like yours. It was green and worn, with fabric stretched thin at the elbows. We set it near the window where the light hit in the late afternoon. I sat in it that evening with a book I hadn't read in years. I didn't turn many pages. I just held it, feeling the weight of it in my lap, the texture of the spine against my palm. Andrew dropped by with June just before sunset. She ran into the kitchen and asked if she could make toast. I said yes. She burned it, twice. The smoke alarm chirped, and we laughed harder than we should have. I showed her how to open the window, how to wave the towel at the detector. "You're a real grown-up now," I told her. She beamed. "I learned from the best." Andrew didn't say much. He never had to. After June went to the porch to play with her sidewalk chalk, he stayed behind, sipping tea that had gone lukewarm. "She's asking about your story more now," he said. "The one from the hospital." "What do you tell her?" I asked. "That it's about a woman who was almost forgotten, but she didn't let them." I nodded. Then I said, "She should know it wasn't about revenge." "I know. It was about remembering who I was before someone else tried to rewrite me." He looked at me then, not like a son looking at his mother, but like a man seeing another human being, fully, for the first time. "She's proud of you," he said, and I believed him. That night, after they left, I sat on the porch with a blanket across my knees and the stars just beginning to emerge. The other chair was empty. I didn't mind. Sometimes silence is not a void. It's a resting place. I thought about everything I'd left behind. Guilt, silence, a name used like a weapon, and everything I had chosen instead. My house, my chair, my rhythm, my voice. I didn't need a parade. I didn't need reconciliation. What I had now was quieter, stronger, mine, and for the first time, in a long, long time, that was enough. I thought I had grown used to the quiet mornings in this little house, but that morning felt different. It wasn't the cold, or the stillness of the air, or even the way the sun hung lower in the sky. It was the feeling I woke up with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. I don't often feel that anymore. After so many years, you learn not to expect too much from the day ahead. But that morning, I knew I was going to do something that mattered. I was going to speak, not to defend myself, not to demand anything, just to tell the truth, because I had survived, and others deserved to know that they could too. Carla came to pick me up. Her car was old and a little uneven on the road, but it still ran smooth. It smelled like roasted coffee and old upholstery. She told me not to worry. "Just a small group," she said. "A few women from the community. It's not formal." I nodded. I didn't say much. The truth was, I had played the conversation over in my mind 100 different ways, and I still felt my hand tremble when I reached for the door handle. They gathered in a modest room behind the center paintings on the wall, folding chairs in a horseshoe shape, a pot of tea in the corner, and a plate of cookies someone had baked that morning. These weren't strangers. I recognized a few from community meals. Others I'd passed in the hallway, but all of them shared the same look the one women get when they've spent too long holding their breath. I stood up, no notes in hand. Just my voice and the memory of everything I'd lived through. I told them about what happened, not all the details, but the moments that stayed with me. The way my daughter looked at me like I was already gone. The feeling of helplessness as I watched the people I loved take from me without hesitation. The moment I realized the silence around me wasn't a pause, it was abandonment. I told them about Joan, about Andrew, about the nurse who spoke up, about how I learned that sometimes silence isn't safety, it's a prison, and how, with time, I found a way to speak again. They didn't interrupt. They didn't ask questions. They just listened, as if what I was saying belonged to all of us, not just me. When I sat back down, no one clapped, but one woman, Ruth, I think her name was, reached over and took my hand. She looked me in the eye and said, "You didn't just survive. You gave us permission to survive too." That afternoon, I didn't go straight home. I walked for a while through the small park behind the center. The wind was cold, but I wasn't. I sat on a bench and watched a little boy chase a squirrel. An older woman walked past with a small dog and smiled. It was the kind of smile you give someone when you've seen them before, and this time you see them differently. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. And that, more than anything, told me I was finally free. I began to notice the silence not as a void, but as a kind of music. Not absence, but space. It came into the house in the early mornings, before the heater clicked on, before the sun filled the kitchen windows. It was the kind of silence I once feared. Now, I welcomed it like an old friend who finally spoke the same language as me. Most days, I started with tea, Earl Grey or chamomile. Something soft, something I didn't have to earn. I'd sit by the window and watch the light move across the floorboards like it was tracing time. I wasn't in a rush anymore. I'd rushed for so many years, rushed to work, to keep the peace, to fix things I didn't break. Now, I let the clock breathe. Michael still came by each Sunday. He brought small things: soup, library books, a broken watch he wanted to repair just to keep his hands busy. Sometimes June came, too, with paint on her fingers and wide-eyed stories about school. She didn't ask about Diana. She just curled up beside me on the porch and asked about the birds. It was easier to talk about birds. The foundation settled into itself like a home finally warmed by the people inside it. Carla kept me updated in neat, thoughtful emails. Sometimes she printed them for me. She said it felt more personal, more real. Every update included a story, not headlines or numbers, just names. A woman who got her name back on the lease. Another who stood up to her son when he tried to force her into a nursing home she didn't choose. Another who walked out of a house where her voice had been a ghost for years. They didn't write speeches. They didn't make the news. But they did something harder. They survived. And that survival echoed. Quiet at first, then stronger. Carla said our waiting room now filled up by 9 a.m. Some came just for the warmth, others for a name on a list. But most came for something they couldn't name until someone handed them a form and said, "You matter here." I started writing again. Not for anyone else, just for myself. I filled a notebook with the kinds of things I used to push aside memories of my mother's kitchen, the feeling of payday when the fridge was finally full, the way my children used to fall asleep against my chest like they trusted the world completely. And I wrote the hard things, too. The slights that didn't look like wounds but bled anyway. The moments when love felt like a trap. The first time I realized silence wasn't always noble. It was just easier for everyone else. But the writing didn't drain me. It restored something. Each sentence, a small act of reclamation. Each paragraph, a reminder. I am still here, still mine. One evening, I found a letter at my door. No stamp, no return address, just my name in a hand I recognized. Diana's. I didn't open it. Not that night. Not the next. I placed it in a drawer, beside the folder with the final trust papers and a photograph of my younger self, arms crossed, eyes certain, mouth soft. The letter didn't burn in my mind. It didn't scream to be heard. It just sat there, waiting. And for once, I didn't feel obligated to answer. That December, the town hosted a winter market at the library lawn. I went with Linda. We didn't buy anything. We just walked slowly between booths, hands wrapped around warm cider. A woman selling knit scarves caught my arm gently. "You're her," she said. "The one who didn't stay silent." I nodded. I didn't need to correct her. That was enough. When I got home that night, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my notebook again. I didn't write much, just one line. This piece was earned, Henny, and I let that be the final word for the day. Winter softened, slowly. The mornings were still cold, but the light lingered a little longer each day. I could feel the seasons beginning to shift, not just in the air, but inside me. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for apologies, not for explanations, not even for closure. I had already begun something new. The foundation continued to grow. Not loudly, not with headlines, but in steady, quiet ways. More women walked through the doors. Some came with questions, some with shame in their eyes, some with nothing but a plastic bag and a folder of papers they didn't know how to read. But they all left with something: information, a name to call, a warm voice that said, "You are not alone." We started holding workshops in community halls and senior centers. I didn't always speak, but I was there. I listened. I nodded. Sometimes I shared a sentence or two, enough to let them know I understood without making their story about mine. At one session, a woman named Teresa stood up with trembling hands and said, "My own daughter told me I was too much, that I should just sign over the house and move into the basement. She said it was better for everyone, but I couldn't do it. I kept hearing your story." That moment stayed with me. Not because I needed the credit, but because it reminded me that our voices carry further than we think. Even the quiet ones. June started bringing me drawings again. One had a house with wide windows and hearts in every room. "That's your house," she said, "because it's full of people who feel better after they visit." I couldn't speak for a moment. I just pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. Michael came by with groceries and questions about new grant paperwork. He never stayed long, just enough to check that I was still eating, still writing, still grounded. He had learned to let me lead. And Linda, she was there as always, steady as an old stone. She didn't ask about Diana. Neither did I. The letter remained in my drawer, unopened. Not out of bitterness, just clarity. That chapter was closed, not by accident, but by choice. One evening, after everyone had gone and the house had fallen quiet, I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the last of the light stretch across the counter. I thought of the women I'd met, the ones who whispered their stories like confessions, the ones who smiled with relief after signing their own names again. I lit a candle on the windowsill, not for prayer, not for mourning, just as a small declaration. I am still here. The woman they tried to erase? She didn't disappear. She became louder in her silence, stronger in her stillness. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. I survived not just what they did to me, but who I used to be for them. And then I let the ink dry without another word. Spring didn't arrive with any fanfare. It crept in like something unsure if it was still welcome. Soft winds, buds on branches, light that lingered just a little longer each evening. I watched it unfold from my porch, a blanket across my knees, a mug warming my palms. The world didn't rush, and for the first time in a long while, neither did I. The house had settled around me. The echoes faded. The shadows no longer felt like memories pressing against the walls. I'd placed everything with intention. One photograph on the mantel, 2 pillows on the couch, one shawl draped always within reach. Nothing extra. Nothing shouting for attention. Just space, and air, and quiet that wasn't lonely. The foundation had grown beyond me. Carla and the others took the reins, and I watched with pride, not control. They invited me to speak at a new workshop for women, over 60 women who'd never signed a lease in their own name, who'd been told someone else would take care of it. I agreed, not because I had something to prove, but because I had something to give. I prepared the way I lived, slowly, carefully, with no need to impress. I wrote down stories instead of bullet points. I didn't begin with facts. I began with what it felt like to lose your voice and not realize it until someone else used it for you. One morning, a woman named Hattie walked into the center, clutching an envelope like it might explode in her hands. Inside was a divorce petition. Her signature wasn't even dry yet. She hadn't told anyone in her family. She whispered, "I didn't know where else to go." Carla took her into a back room, and I stood at the doorway, just watching. I knew that feeling. The moment when silence breaks and no one's there to catch the sound. But now there was somewhere to fall, and hands that knew how to hold gently. June visited the next weekend. She brought a small tin box with folded pieces of paper inside. "These are the questions I haven't asked anyone else," she told me, eyes serious, voice soft. We sat on the floor together. She read them one by one. "Did you ever feel invisible? Were you scared when they tried to hurt you? Did you stop loving her?" I answered honestly, not to teach her, but to remind myself that truth can live in soft places too. I told her that love isn't always enough, that being brave doesn't mean you don't cry, that sometimes surviving isn't about fighting louder, it's about refusing to disappear. That night, after she left, I wrote in my journal, "The quiet isn't empty anymore. It holds everything I once had to carry alone. Now, it carries me." It was early April when I heard from Andrew again this time, not with updates, not with legal papers, just a simple, "Are you free this Thursday?" I told him I was always free on Thursdays. I had made sure of it. He picked me up in the late afternoon. The air smelled like fresh rain on brick, and the clouds drifted with a kind of slowness I'd grown fond of. We didn't speak much in the car. We didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer strained. It felt earned. He drove us to a small auditorium near the center of town. "They're honoring the foundation," he said as we parked. "Carla insisted you come." Inside, the lights were soft, the room filled with chairs and quiet murmurs. No stage, just a microphone on a simple wooden stand. The kind of room built more for storytelling than applause. Carla introduced the evening. She spoke about dignity, about what it meant to reclaim a voice long buried. She said the work we were doing wasn't revolutionary because it was loud, it was revolutionary because it was steady, and because it lasted. Then she said my name. I stood slowly, not because I was weak, but because I understood the weight of the moment. I walked to the microphone and let the silence settle before I spoke. "I don't want to be remembered for what was taken from me," I said. "I want to be remembered for what I refused to give up. My name, my right to decide, my story." I saw tears in some eyes. Hands held still, breath caught. And I knew then that it wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd been told to sit down, to be quiet, to not make trouble. And to everyone who stood up anyway. Afterward, a woman approached me, mid-50s, hair pinned back. She didn't introduce herself, she simply said, "I never thought it could be different, until I heard you." I held her hand and nodded. That was enough. That night, back in my room, I didn't replay the evening. I didn't overthink what I said, or what I wore, or who clapped. I just lay there, still, whole, and thought to myself, I've come home to myself. The final season of that year arrived with a whisper, not a storm. Autumn slipped into winter so gently that I didn't notice the change until frost lingered longer on the porch railings, and I caught myself holding my cup of tea with both hands for warmth. Time had softened its edge, and with it, so had I. I had moved into my smaller home with the intention of starting over, not rebuilding what had been lost, but cultivating something new, something mine. The foundation continued its work under Carla's leadership. Michael stopped by weekly. June visited more often than not, always bringing with her something that couldn't be bought: wonder. One morning, she arrived carrying a shoebox. "It's for you," she said shyly, placing it on the kitchen table. "It's memories." Inside were drawings, crayon portraits of me, stick figures holding hands, cutouts of hearts, and one page where she had traced her tiny hand and written, "This is so you remember how small I was when you got big again." I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because the emotion was warm, not heavy. I lifted her into my arms and said the only thing that mattered. I remember. I'll always remember. That afternoon, I sat in the sunroom and thought of everything I had once feared would be my final memory: the cold beep of the monitor, the grip of betrayal, the silence that nearly choked me. Now I had something better to hold on to. June's laughter from the yard, Michael's steady hands placing groceries in my cupboard, Linda's handwritten note tucked in the silverware drawer. These were the moments that mattered. Not the headlines, not the court documents, not even the justice, though I would never stop being grateful for that. What mattered was that I had not disappeared. I had not become what they wanted me to be: weak, silent, replaceable. I had become someone else entirely. One evening, just before the first snowfall, Michael brought over a framed photograph. It was taken at the Foundation's recent event, a wide shot of me standing beneath the banner that read, "The Helen Caraway Fund for Dignity in Aging." He placed it above the fireplace. "I know you don't like a fuss," he said, "but this isn't a trophy. It's a reminder." I tilted my head. "Of what?" He smiled faintly. "That you didn't just survive. You built something after. And do." I sat with that for a long time. It's easy to think survival is the end of the story, that once you make it through, the rest is just coasting. But the truth is, surviving was only the beginning. What came next? The rebuilding, the reclaiming, the reshaping that was the real work, the real triumph. And I had done it, not with vengeance, but with purpose. One quiet morning, I returned to the Women's Center alone. Carla had invited me to come speak with a small group of women who were entering the transitional housing program. I wasn't sure I had anything left to say, but as I entered the garden and saw them gathered around in a loose circle, some with gray hair, some with fresh bruises, some with eyes too tired for their years, I knew why I was there. I sat down, waited. No speech, no introduction, just me. Then I said, I was once where you are, not in body but in spirit. Small, dismissed, almost erased. They listened. And then, I said, I realized something simple but true. Silence isn't peace. It's just space waiting to be filled with truth. I paused, and you get to choose what your truth is now. Later, one of the women, her name was Irene, approached me. You don't look like someone who's been through all that, she said. I smiled. That's because I didn't stay in it. I came out. As I walked home, snow had just begun to fall. Not harsh, not hurried, just slow, deliberate flakes that settled on the sidewalk like feathers. I thought of the letter still in my drawer, the one from Diana, unopened, untouched. I didn't hate her, not anymore, but I also didn't need her words to know who I was. The truth I had written for myself was enough. That night, I made one final entry in my journal. Not dramatic, just honest. I no longer need to be seen to know I exist. I no longer need to be forgiven to be free. I am here, and I am whole. I closed the journal, placed it in the drawer beside June's drawings. Then I turned off the light and let the quiet settle around me, not as an absence, but as a friend. Because now, silence was mine. What did you feel while listening to this story all the way through? If it touched your heart, leave the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't feel connected to it, feel free to write 0. Every piece of feedback means a lot to me, because it's thanks to you that I can keep going. It's from your responses that I draw the energy to tell the next chapter a new story is coming, even deeper, even more moving. And I truly hope you'll be there to listen with me.